British Empire, the largest empire in history, arguably played a bigger role in shaping the modern world than any other entity in recent memory. Everything from the widespread use of English across the globe, the existence of the United States, and globalization all exist, at least in the way we know them, because of the British Empire. Despite growing from a medium-sized European kingdom to the whole world's primary superpower over the course of 300 years, in a matter of only decades, it all came crashing down as colonies gained independence through both violence and diplomacy. But what if this didn't happen? At least not in the same way. What if the British Empire survived till the present? For this scenario, the British Empire does not survive in the traditional sense. Decolonization was, in my opinion, mostly inevitable, at least without completely changing centuries of history. But the British could have held on to a whole lot more with better leaders and hindsight. So immediately, the first thing I think Britain could realistically have kept is Ireland. With its close cultural ties and eventually shared language, it had the potential to become another country within the United Kingdom. And well, did, partially, in the form of Northern Ireland. Britain's relationship with Ireland was particularly complicated, and its treatment of the island particularly horrible. We could go way back and prevent the Irish famine, but that would have global implications and should probably be a scenario in itself. Ireland faces the Irish famine and harsh treatment under British rule, creating the same Irish diaspora as in real life. But in the late 1800s, our first point of departure, Britain very actively tries to address historical grievances and begins to treat Ireland less as a colony and more as an integral part of the kingdom with rights and autonomy. The Irish Parliament in Dublin handles domestic affairs, while Britain retains control over defence and foreign policy. Britain implements significant land reforms, redistributing land to Irish tenant farmers and boosting the economy. Religious equality laws are enforced. While the wounds of colonialism and oppression are not just magically healed, the British do just enough to keep the Irish from pushing for full independence. Apart from more Irishmen fighting in the Second World War, from then on, history remains much the same all the way up until the late 1940s. Here, during the post-war reconstruction, Britain develops and implements an extensive plan where it attempts to keep as much global influence as possible, whilst still accepting the inevitability of decolonization. Britain does this by immediately post-war, offering paths to self-governance and independence to all its major colonies, whilst focusing all of its resources on strengthening its position in a handful of small strategically important regions like Hong Kong, Singapore, and Cyprus. Essentially just a more well-thought-out version of what Britain was forced to do a bit later in real life. Being very proactive with these efforts allows Britain to very quickly following World War II, increase control, but also development and quality of life in the minor territories it wants to keep, which strengthens support for Britain among locals and minimizes independence movements. So instead of many British colonies and protectorates lasting well into the 1960s like in the real world, by the 1950s in this scenario, Britain has already granted most of its empire full independence. The remnants of the empire are organized into the British realm, which acts as the sovereign state, whereas the Commonwealth of Nations plays a similar but more involved role than in real life, as it introduces legally binding treaties and trade agreements. Britain also manages to avoid the Suez Crisis through more successful political maneuvering. In real life, the Suez Canal was owned by the Suez Canal Company, which Britain and France essentially owned. But in this scenario, they established the Suez Canal Zone, officially an international zone within Egypt, where all ships have free access, only protected and maintained by Britain. Basically the exact same status and relationship to the United States and Panama the Panama Canal Zone had at the time. This doesn't give President Nasser of Egypt the same sort of legal path to seizing the canal, as there is no company owning it he could nationalize. It also gives the US more political wiggle room. In real life, their hands were pretty much tied, as they'd appear super hypocritical if they opposed Soviet imperialist actions in Hungary, but not British and French imperialist actions in Egypt. But with this new framing, the US would not directly support, but could ignore the British maintaining control over the canal, as legally speaking the British would just be protecting an international zone. Through successful reforms and continued investments into its overseas territories, Britain goes from a global empire to more of a federation of tiny wealthy territories across the world. Ties both economically and militarily with former settler colonies, especially Australia and New Zealand, remain much stronger. On the other hand, the more prominent Commonwealth of Nations, gradually turning into a more meaningful union, pushes more countries to leave with time than in real life, as they have their own geopolitical goals outside of this basically early version of CANZUK. Otherwise, the Cold War progresses much like in real life, but with Britain generally just playing a bigger role. They're still behind the US in terms of power, but are a much more important American ally and Western power. Still, it isn't enough to change the outcome of conflicts like the Vietnam War, and whilst Britain would have more resources at its disposal, it would also have its hands full keeping the British realm together. Rising nationalism would pose a threat, especially in territories like Cyprus, Bahrain, and Singapore, and to keep them, Britain would have to actively spend a lot of its wealth on developing them, and partially anglicizing them through education, and incentivizing Brits to move there. Cyprus as a whole eventually proves to be too great a task. In exchange for defensive treaties to protect it from Turkey and full independence, Britain keeps Akrotiri as a Gibraltar-esque territory, which at this point is not just home to an airbase, but a major port, as well as a major town settled by Brits. With Britain's much more active role in Cold War geopolitics, the Six-Day War and Yom Kippur War could have been avoided. While tensions between Israel and its neighbors would obviously remain high, the dynamics would be different. By maintaining the Suez Canal as an international zone protected by British forces with American backing, Egypt would be unable to close the canal to Israeli vessels without risking a larger conflict. This removes the primary trigger for the Six-Day War. In the short term, Britain would not be popular in the Arab world for obvious reasons, but on the other hand, preventing these two conflicts would be much better for the Palestinians. Another interesting aspect of this alternate history scenario is Britain's space program. In real life, it ended fairly quickly, but as a country that sees itself as a third, even if slightly less relevant world power, Britain would, for the sake of its international standing, invest significantly more in its space program and become a third player in the space race. Its achievements would likely be less impressive given its more limited resources, but I could see Britain launching satellites, a man into orbit, and probes across the solar system. This would likely affect the formation of the European Space Agency. Britain, even with it being a more relevant power on its own, would likely still participate in early European cooperative ventures, especially given it's still a secondary world power more comparable to, say, Japan in the 90s than the US or USSR. So its role would likely mirror that of the French Space Agency in real life, being an independent program, but often working with the European Space Agency on larger projects. Without the 1973 oil crisis and Britain generally being much stronger, Argentina never tries to invade the Falkland Islands. This doesn't have any profound global implications, but it does mean Margaret Thatcher isn't re-elected in 1983, changing Britain's domestic politics during the 80s, preventing some privatization, and resulting in the public sector being much more prominent for longer in Britain. The collapse of the Soviet Union goes much the same, as a strong secondary Western power doesn't really change the overall trends in the Eastern Bloc. But the development of the European Union is altered significantly. With Britain being wealthier and stronger on its own, it doesn't have the same incentives to join the Union. Instead, it becomes a close partner, opting into certain agreements like Switzerland and Norway, but never joining the Parliament in Brussels fully, as it has its own union project with its former colonies in the form of the Commonwealth of Nations. This means EU integration goes much more smoothly, with the Union moving towards something closer to a federation more rapidly. As for the Commonwealth of Nations, its development mirrors that of the European Union, with a formal Commonwealth-wide parliament being established. This leads to Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania leaving the Union as they pursue their own union project. Although relations between Britain and Eastern Africa remain close, just as relations with India do, especially now as China starts growing economically. By the modern day, we have a still globe-spanning British realm that in some sense mirrors a more successful France in its handling of decolonization. Rather than gradually giving all of its colonies independence, it rigorously held onto smaller strategic territories across the globe, leaving a globe-spanning federation consisting of Britain and many microstates. The sovereign state with a seat at the UN is the British Realm, but the British Realm can be divided into 5 major subdivisions: the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, British Asia, the British Caribbean, the British Mediterranean, and finally the British Overseas Territories, which aren't a cohesive unit, rather just many small territories all around the world. Even more prominent is the broader Commonwealth of Nations, a union with many of its former colonies, similar in scope to the European Union. The Commonwealth of Nations as a whole has a population of almost 223 million and a GDP of 10.5 trillion, collectively making up one of the world's great powers, even if a very devolved one, only a tad behind the European Union, the United States, and China. But that's about all for now. Remember to leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this in the future, and a big thank you to all my channel members. See you next time.